And it's Friday Live with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes, and I'm joined by the editor of Byline Times, Hardeep Matharu, and a special guest this week, Simon Nixon, a former columnist for the Wall Street Journal and for the Times, and a leader writer at the Times. So we're joined by very esteemed company. This week, we'll be talking about three major things. First, Rachel Reeves's black holes. Are there more than one of them? What's going on with finances? Simon, with his background in business and economic journalists, can finally enlighten us all the various rumours and contradictions floating around Rachel Reeves's discovery of the government's budget. From that, we'll also be looking at what's happening to the takeover or sale of the Telegraph and Spectator, big media brands in Britain, and with Paul Marshall, the major investor in GB News and hedge funder who made millions out of Brexit, being the lead bidder at the moment. And following on from what GB News does, we'll be looking, incidentally, at the far right and the awful events this week, mainly in Southport, but across various British citizen towns, as disinformation has led to attacks on mosques and dozens of police injured. But first, Simon, is this a new black hole? So if I read rightly today, the incoming Labour Chancellor knew about a £20 billion shortfall in the government finances. And now there's a £22.5 billion new hole that's emerged from unregistered spending commitments. Is that right? I'm a layman on this stuff. Can you explain to me what's happened this week in the Treasury?
Yes, Peter. Well, the black hole that we all knew about, that the Institute for Fiscal Studies warned us about, was an £18 billion black hole over the life of the next Parliament for 5 years. Rachel Reeves has discovered a £22 billion black hole in the current fiscal year. Additional
to this 18? Or
yes, some of it was in the 18, but there's other things that she has discovered that weren't in the books.
And she's accused the former Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, of deceiving. Is that right? Is that fair enough?
Yes.
The OBR has said, we didn't know anything about this. There seems to be some deception.
Well, obviously there's quite a lot of shades of grey in all of this. But even before the election, there was newspaper reports that Sue Gray, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, was going around with a shit list of unexploded bombs that they were going to discover early in the first term, one of which was public sector pay awards, and 9 billion of the 22 billion is the above inflation public sector pay awards that she has decided to accept the recommendations of the pay boards.
Right. So they were commitments to future spending, which she'd have to abrogate those agreements to deny.
Yes. But I mean, the Tories would say you didn't have to accept them. And she would say, well, the pay reviews had been done in good faith and the Tories hadn't set affordability parameters. So there's a dispute around that. The one where she seems to have sort of won the argument with the Institute for Fiscal Studies and to some extent with the OBR is over the cost of the asylum system, where she says there's a £6.5 billion black hole because there was no funding for the 60 or was it 90,000 now refugees who are currently in hotels. The Tories say, well, we're going to send them all to Rwanda, which is
at some huge cost. It cost 800 million for
completely implausible
people,
that you were going to send 60,000 people in a year to Rwanda. But that is a cost that was clearly not in the book. So there were quite a lot of costs. But the bigger picture is the political one, which is, to my mind, the more interesting and important point. That actually, as you say, everybody knew that there was a black hole and that both parties' plans were implausible, that taxes would have to go up. But the £22 billion that she has identified is exactly the same amount of money, £22 billion, that the Tories just cut in cutting national insurance.
So is this like, we famously, they always do this in the Treasury, there's no money left leaving books. Do you think this has been set as a bomb?
It was a trap. It was absolutely a trap set by the Tories. They made totally unaffordable tax cuts ahead of the election, knowing they were unaffordable. And the first bit of the trap was thinking that if Labour said that's wrong, then they could say, we've cut your taxes and they're not going to cut your taxes. Right. So they hoped that they would get some electoral advantage in the election over that. But Labour didn't walk into that trap. So they said, no, we'll match those tax cuts. But the second bit of the trap, of course, was that everybody knew that after the election, they would have to raise the taxes. And so the Tories hoped that in month one of a new Labour government, they would effectively have to breach faith with the British public. So that's the trap that they set. And that's why this was the economics are almost unimportant. The politics is what really mattered here. This was a deliberate attempt by the Tories, with the help of the right-wing press, it has to be said, to frame a Labour government in week one, effectively, as being fundamentally dishonest and untrustworthy. So this was a battle, really, to frame the Labour government. So Rachel Reeves had to come out all guns blazing and fighting because she had to win this narrative in order to be able to win permission to put taxes up. And the Tories are fighting essentially a narrative that will define this government and essentially their electoral strategy for 2029.
Is this normal?
This is a very big moment in that respect.
But is it normal? They're playing with our finances. They're playing with, and we could talk a bit with Hardeep about where some of those billions went on refugees and who benefited from those contracts for private accommodation. But is that normal for an outgoing government to leave a bomb at the feet of the incoming government, which is just going to cause turmoil in public finances? Obviously, it's something landing in Labour's lap. But does it not undermine confidence in the economy, confidence in the government to a larger scale, to all our detriment? We saw quite a friendly handover from Rishi Sunak in the House of Parliament, in the House of Commons, congratulating Keir Starmer. It was all very amicable, showing what we like to think we can have peaceful transitions of power, unlike the United States last election. Is it normal to just try to sabotage an incoming government like this?
Yes, I think it's part of the answer. I mean, to the extent that Gordon Brown in 1997 said he would match the Tory spending plans. And Ken Clarke said after the election, I would never have done that. I would never have stuck to my plans after the election. But that was in the context of an economy that was growing 2 or 3% a year, where debt was about 35% of GDP. So this really was in a totally different context.
Debt is, just to remind people, what percentage of GDP now?
Close to 100%.
Wow.
So,
biggest since the war.
Yes, so this is in a totally different context. I think those Tory tax cuts were utterly reckless before the election. And then Tories would say that, for example, in 2010, they will contrast what Labour has done in this time round with what they did then. And they will say, well, in 2010, the Tories said, we will have to cut spending, and made the case for it ahead of the election, and then we had austerity afterwards. And they would say, well, Labour has not taken the chance, to be honest, ahead of this election.
Well, we know that austerity wasn't quite honest, and that certainly counterproductive in terms of growth in debt. They promised to bring down the national debt because of austerity and the knock-on effects of that. It increased, yeah? So
yes, I don't think I'm certainly not defending austerity. I think it was a mistake. The point I would make really is the difference is that in 2010, the Tories could make the case for austerity and have most of the right-wing media behind them, even though the intellectual argument underpinning it, which was that Gordon Brown blew up the global economy because he ran a 2% deficit, was fundamentally fraudulent and dishonest. But they were able to make that argument and win it with the enormous help of the conservative newspapers.
And the Liberal Democrat Party as well.
Yeah, and this time round, though, and I speak as somebody who was the chief lead writer of The Times until a year ago, there was no way that Labour could have made that argument without being completely destroyed. The Times, after I left, I hasten to add, week in, week out, would write a leader basically saying to Labour, goading them to say, show us your tax rises, show us your tax rises. Right. So never saying to the Tories, show us your spending cuts, or whatever, and
or your black holes,
or your black holes. So I can understand why Labour felt obliged to take this very tough fiscal stance ahead of the election. I think they escaped the first bit of the trap. I think that they will probably get away with the second bit of the trap too, which is that they will be able to put through the tax rises, and I think they probably will win the argument on the black hole. But the third bit of the trap, which I think is going to be more difficult for them, is that because they have ruled out most of the big taxes, and they've agreed to stick to what everybody really accepts are really badly framed fiscal rules, they will end up having to make cuts to things that are good for growth, like infrastructure, cutting infrastructure programs that should be there, and putting up some taxes that could be bad for growth as well. So I think that there's a danger that they've been boxed into some pretty bad options or bad choices.
One of the things that John Curtis has appeared on this program, when we had our larger studio, was that we're in a very different world with the public in terms of their attitudes to spending and taxation. That in 2010, there was a sense the public felt the state could shrink a bit. They felt wealthy. They felt they should have more of their own money. Now, the emphasis on services. They want more spent on services, less interested in individual consumption. So what taxes does that leave available to Rachel Reeves? Because she's said she won't raise national insurance, income tax, or VAT. Is that right? I think these are the three purges.
Yes, yeah.
Are there other levers?
And corporation tax,
and
too.
Corporation tax.
So, yes, I mean, effectively, you're left really with taxes around wealth.
Right.
You know, and look, to be clear, we don't tax wealth particularly well in this country in the sense that,
So just explain to the audience, people's existing assets, their big paintings, their houses, their shares, if you inherit, you won't get taxed on those, where there is a bit of inheritance tax. People are taxed mainly on income in this country.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think most tax experts would say that we don't tax wealth in this country particularly effectively.
And that would hit, because we know that indirect taxes, which are the purchasing of VAT, hit the poor.
Yes, they're very regressive.
Whereas wealth, regressive. Where wealth taxes, one assume, hit the wealthiest more. What kind of wealth taxes could be increased?
So, for example, inheritance tax is effectively a voluntary tax once you're rich in this country.
How's it voluntary?
Well, in the sense that there are so many ways of avoiding it
right.
if you have a lot of money.
Trusts and all these weird offshore
it hits the middle classes, but it doesn't hit
The
the
honest
rich.
middle
Yeah,
classes.
exactly, but it doesn't hit the rich. So that's one tax which is actually quite ripe for reform. Then there is capital gains tax, where this debate's been going on for decades, really. I mean, there are different ways of doing it, but there's clearly an issue where, again, if you're rich, it's fairly easy to have your income reclassified as a capital gain and then taxed at a much lower rate.
So capital gains, I don't have any capitals to tax, but something like 40%, it's a static amount, doesn't matter how much you sell. It's not good data.
So back in the 1980s, Nigel Lawson's great 1986 reforming budget, they equalised the rates of income tax and capital gains tax at 40%.
Right.
And then there was an inflation taper to make sure that you weren't being taxed on inflation, essentially. And that was a lot of support to that. And actually, Gordon Brown in particular, over the years, played with that and reduced it. And the idea was to sort of encourage more investment and more entrepreneurialism by reducing the rate of capital gains tax. But that's an area where you could raise money. But then that would have implications for investment. So that's the challenge, that they're going to try and raise money from non-doms. There's a good argument for doing that. But on the other hand, if you don't have any regime for encouraging rich business people to come and set up shop here in Britain, that is a problem. So designing a tax regime is difficult. Everything has adverse consequences.
And you don't know, it's a dynamic situation. You pull this, you put that limit in, and it has that effect, a bit like recording a podcast.
Yes. The other area is pensions, which again, there's a huge problems with pensions in this country. It's a huge issue, the pension system. It's been effectively under assault for decades now. We used to have the best pension system in the world, and now we've got a looming pension crisis sort of coming down the line very quickly. But on the other hand,
just briefly, why is that? Is that badly invested pension, some other?
Well, we used to have this phenomenal corporate defined benefit pension system in this country, which has effectively shut down about 20 years ago.
And it's all gone to private, to these.
It's all gone out to these defined contribution schemes.
Right.
But the average size of the defined contribution scheme pot is £30,000. It's not enough to buy any pension at all. And the Cameron government brought in a system of auto-enrolment, which has been quite successful in getting people to save, but not nearly enough.
Yeah.
And then, of course, people who are self-employed aren't part of that. So there's a big problem with pensions, but that is an area where there are generous tax breaks for pensions, which could be a tempting target.
So we're talking about a sum in total of this black hole, 22 billion, did you say? Is that a lot of money? I mean, I remember the PPE contracts, the test and trace was 30 billion. In the scale of things, we have to be very careful. It's very interesting, there's some people say, obviously it's not quite the same as a credit card, and we could just redefine anything and spend as much as we like or break taxes. But obviously we can't, can we? Because it exists in the global market. And when Liz Truss tried to cut taxes and not account for them, it did hit the pound. So we're not completely free. But you say the current fiscal rules themselves are too constraining. We can't do whatever we like, because otherwise we're perceived as a bit of a basket case. But you're saying these fiscal rules are too tight and we can adjust there? Or?
I'm saying they're badly designed, really. Right. I think what we learned from the Liz Truss episode, I mean, I didn't learn, I knew it, but she learned it.
We all learned it.
She learned it, is that you need your credibility with the markets is crucial.
Explain why that is, because what happened with Liz Truss, they didn't believe her, that she didn't go to the OBR, didn't get her budget assessed.
Sacked the head of the Treasury, didn't tell the Bank of England.
So that's a crisis of confidence. Then what happens is government debt, bonds, they become more expensive. We have to pay more in interest rates. And there was something going to happen with pension funds.
Yes. I didn't come up with the term, but I like to think I did more than my fair share of popularising it. The British government bonds, gilts, acquired a moron premium. We had to pay extra interest on our debt to account for the moronic policies of a government that clearly didn't know what it was doing.
So it's a confidence thing.
It was a confidence thing.
And that, in a way, is that what Rachel Reed is doing as part of this narrative? It's not so much those rules matter. It's more that she can look competent and the right-wing press tries to paint her as a liar. Is this, in a way, you're still playing with animal spirits?
Yes. On the one hand, the rules are badly framed because they're very easily gameable. But on the other hand, they are badly framed because they force bad political choices. One of which is that essentially anything that has a payback beyond 5 years, which is almost any big infrastructure project, doesn't make sense under the fiscal rules because you can't
see its benefit.
You've got to have the benefit within 5 years. And so it prioritises or incentivizes short-term spending, and it encourages spending on consumption rather than investment.
Right.
And
in the electoral cycle, unfortunately, isn't it? So if it's only 5 years, you're looking towards the next election rather than the long-term future of the country.
So everyone knows those rules are bad. And in fact, what's interesting is that actually people in the markets have been saying, look, these rules, you don't have to stick by those rules, they're pretty daft. We'd quite like you to spend more on infrastructure and investment in Britain. But actually the rules, I think, had more of a political salience than they did for the markets. I mean, I think there was a debate to be had around what the right fiscal posture for Britain was. But politically, she had to adopt Hunt's rules because, again, that would expose her otherwise to these Tory attacks.
So you're saying, I'm always amazed that the right-wing press got more meetings with Number 10 every year for the last back to Blair than any other head of the industry. The government is setting these rules, not on the basis even of global markets, of the right-wing press. Their main customer or their main challenge in setting whether we should spend more on investment is what the Mail or the Telegraph or the Times, you, the leader writer of the Times, might say.
Obviously, no one wants to pay more tax.
Yeah.
So,
especially if you're a non-dom multimillionaire who owns a newspaper.
Yes, but generally people don't want to pay more tax. And I think in all democracies, this is an issue. I mean, France is having a political crisis at the moment, effectively, because the political parties, other than Macron's party, can't make a rational argument on tax. And Macron's party suffered for it. And in America, where they're having an election where they're talking, both sides talk nonsense about it. American debt's now $35 trillion. It's gone up by $2 trillion in the last year or something. It's absolutely astonishing. So no one wants to pay more tax, and politicians don't want to be honest about it. So that's not a peculiarly British problem. But what I think is an issue is that, as you were saying earlier, as John Curtis was obviously saying to you before, that British public do want better services and they do want a lot of these issues fixed, but we couldn't have a sensible argument about it in a sense because the media, and I think the Conservative papers in particular, help frame this argument very narrowly around these issues of tax. And I think they felt they had to adopt these conservative positions on tax and debt just to be able to have any chance of winning the election.
Just before I bring Hardeep in, just two questions. One is, have the right-wing press successfully framed this as Reeves immediately reneging? And what did the markets make of that election a month ago? I remember, back in my youth when it was the runs on the pound and, Wilson and Heath, the markets, and you'd read the world assessment from whether the stock exchange went up or down, or it was always all about the exchange rate, or all these different factors to measure the confidence or not in an incoming government. What's your reading of how foreign investors, the markets, have reacted to Keir Starmer's first month?
Well, again, it's very difficult to separate signal from noise in the markets always. The stock market has been a serial underperformer for 8 years now since Brexit. I've written for my own Substack, Wealth of Nations, about that.
Wealth of Nations, go over to Substack and subscribe. It's very, very good.
In fact, Byline Times reprinted that.
Of course, because we recognise very, very good Substack.
So Byline Times, we will know very well, therefore, that the stock market has been a huge problem for Britain. And the pound has been, since Brexit, also a very poor performer. The pound did rise in the last few weeks, and some people said that's confidence in Starmer. I think it's actually got probably more to do with expectations around interest rates in Britain and America, which is what really drives these things. And the stock market has had a good couple of weeks, but that's partly because of fears of World War III in the Middle East and the oil price, which the stock market is particularly exposed to. So, but I do think, having said that, all that one is picking up from reporting from the markets, particularly, people think Britain has some very serious economic challenges. I think people definitely think that Britain is in a much better position now with a stable government that is going to tackle the biggest supply side challenges, which is planning and infrastructure.
And of course, it's got a large majority, so you don't get like Theresa May.
So I don't think there's any question that people. I mean, I've seen analyst notes and commentary from the City banks. All of them essentially are more positive on the UK now than they were a month ago. You know, when and how that translates into moves in markets that you can actually point to. Sentiment gets you so far, but people want to see the evidence. But I do think there's no doubt there's a huge shift in sentiment towards Britain since the Labour.
We have interest rates going down.
Yeah,
I mean, that's mainly a global thing. And you say about this planning and infrastructure and a sense of stability in the government. And eventually, doesn't that begin to feed through into the economy in that debt's cheaper? The Truss effect, the more on premium, which I love. It's expensive, and stability helps if you're trying to reconstruct.
Yeah, no, I think they've been lucky with their timing in one respect, which is that the interest rates are now coming down.
So people might think, Labour's, my mortgages are cheap.
Yes. And as I say, on the black hole, I think they have won that argument. And I think
some aggressive posturing, interestingly, from Reeves herself, calling Hunt a liar and all that. They really remember 2010, don't they, when the narrative was defined while they were looking for a new leader by the coalition government.
Yes, my sense is that people aren't going to get dragged down into the weeds of the Rwanda policy and whatever. The big picture is that people know that the Tories...
You can say it on this.
Well, they wrecked the economy over 14 years, and they deliberately had a scorched earth strategy ahead of the election, and everybody can see it, everybody knows it. And if Labour weren't completely clear ahead of it, I think people can also understand why. So I may be projecting, but my sense is that that's where things are on the blow.
And Hardeep, just we'll start moving on to subjects. I'm interested to see what you make of this as a very smart editor, but economics is maybe not something you talk about much. But you did publish a piece this week where some of, I think it's 6 billion on emergency housing for refugees, and it's deliberate backup, stop the boats, this kind of weaponization and this theatre of cruelty. And a lot of this goes to private landlords, doesn't it? That's what Andrew Kersley...
In the asylum system.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you have 3 companies that are always getting sort of millions and millions of pounds in public spending for contracts for accommodation for people who are waiting to see whether they can claim refugee status legally in this country. Asylum seekers. But those companies themselves are often not even providing the accommodation. They're outsourcing that to third companies as well. And then there's the failings of these firms themselves, which Andrew Kersley's looked at for us.
And some of them are quite significant Conservative Party donors, aren't they, some of these firms, I believe, I think.
Yeah. I mean, that's a specific thing. I can't quite remember, Peter. But I think what's really interesting about what Simon is saying is there is a notion that this week the Labour government has, and particularly Rachel Reeves, has managed to navigate these traps. But I do wonder what the medium term to longer term trap is that the Conservative Party, along with its supporters in the right-leaning press, are setting for the government. Because the stakes are really high. And I think the Keir Starmer administration has come in and really, really emphasised 2 things. This is a government of service and integrity, and we'll follow through what we say because building trust with the electorate is so important and it's been so undermined. And also this notion that we're not going to get bogged down in performative politics and the anti-woke wars. We're going to go back to basics. We're going to have a look at how to change people's lives through policies and public services. But that is very reliant on growth. economic growth. And I do think we need to see some more rigorous analysis of what that really will involve, because it seems that Labour is banking on that in order to deliver some sort of tangible change, probably not immediately, but over the course of this Parliament. And it seems that this is the strategy which theoretically will keep people from not going to more extreme politics or the Farage and the reforms of this world. But if they can see tangible change in their lives over a few years, that will make a difference. And I do wonder that even within just a few weeks, this has happened. And there is still a sense that I think for the ordinary person on the street who has a cursory glance at the BBC News website or some of the front pages, I think they will have a sense of, oh, right, okay, so the finances are worse than we have been told.
Right.
And now Labour is
Process
acknowledging that
disillusionment.
there is a sense that I think the public is already tired and cynical. And even just headlines like that, which again, I don't think members of the public are going to dissect it in the level of detail we are doing. But even just that messaging that, oh, right.
But they're interested.
Now we're being told that there's not enough money. Now, after the election, we're being told this. So I think that in itself is not ideal.
It's a lack of trust. And I certainly
yeah.
see the tweets saying, oh, he's already reneged.
Yeah.
Both from left and right, you know.
Because it's more complicated than
and
that.
especially the pension, extra heating allowance for pensioners. But again, we're news aficionados.
Yeah.
If your interest rates go down, if there is a boost in housing gets cheaper because there's more supply and your kids can eventually buy a house rather than wait 30 years for it. But obviously that takes time.
It takes time. And also, as I said, the Conservative Party and the right-leaning press, it's been fairly quiet, I would say, at the moment, which is not surprising. We've just had a general election. It's now summer,
only 4
Parliament's in
weeks.
recess. Exactly.
4 weeks.
But I wouldn't underestimate the longer-term strategy, which is to, over time, present a narrative where Labour has not only had to acknowledge that public finances are in a worse state and we can't do what we'd like to do, but also this key thing that Simon's pointing out, which is the economic orthodoxy which has prevailed in the last 14 years is fundamentally not going to be challenged. And I think that is more important. Just reading a few articles myself this week on how this black hole was covered. Already notions about, well, you wouldn't run a household this way so you can't do it with the economy. The very key framing that austerity was completely...
Max out your credit
Yeah.
cards.
And
Had
again,
a mortgage on a house and built a kitchen extension.
really simplistic narratives given to the public in the hope that they will be able to relate to them and they will have some political mileage. But actually, you know, Simon will know, everyone will know, running a government, a country, a state is very different from how you'd run your household. But there's already a sense this week that the Labour government's not fundamentally going to challenge that because, one, that is hard to do, right? The challenge politicians and journalists have is how to, and we have this all the time on Byline Times, how do you engage the public in a way that gets at some of the complexity and the contradictions and the nuances of any issue? That is a challenge anyway. But then, as Simon is saying, you have this added layer of the right-leaning press, which is not going to want you to do that anyway. And so I think all in all, yes, they've sidestepped these few initial traps this week. I do wonder in the medium to long term how this is all going to play out, especially because if the fundamentals are not being shifted, then Rachel Reeves is having to play by the rules of a game that has been set by an opposition, which Labour's come to government saying we're going to do things completely differently. So it's potentially problematic down the line.
Which takes us to the abiding theme of Byline Times and Byline, which is the culture in which we address these issues. We have these discussions about spending versus investment, which rules are applicable. So it may be worth looking at that culture in light of what's happening with one of the mainstays of the Conservative press, which was the Telegraph, owned by the Buckley brothers, single Buckley brother now, being investigated, according to some of these tax arrangements of the previous owners, is being investigated by the NCA and HMRC, apparently, which is all very intriguing. Do you see any signs of a change? We can talk about that particular bid in the Telegraph. Telegraph, just for people who don't know maybe, who didn't read it, was famously conservative, but had lots of kind of left-wing journalists working on it, and had a famously great separation between opinion and news coverage. Peter Oborne left it. He's our regular diarist because the walls between advertising and content were breached. This is over the HSBC Bank and about them withdrawing funds to certain people. What's happening with the takeover? It's a group which includes The Spectator, doesn't it? TMG, well, their Telegraph Media Group. What's happening with that? And what does that, the current bidders and the current state of it mean in terms of whether that coverage is going to continue in this anti-woke way or could go back to, let's say, Telegraph used to be for free trade, used to be for the single market, used to be for classic old Pelian virtues when it came to the economy, is now all about stamping out woke and punishing trading partners, the whole sort of autarky, which is very unfamiliar to the Conservative Party, or was. What's happening with that bid, and what would that say about where the Conservatives will go, Simon?
Well, there's an auction ongoing for the newspaper at the moment. I mean, the papers had to be put up for sale because the Barclay brothers owed £1 billion to Lloyds Bank, which they couldn't repay. So Lloyds Bank seized the papers and put them up for auction. An American private equity firm bought the papers, or at least it bought an option. It paid off the Barclay brothers' debt to Lloyds and in return received an option to buy the Telegraph Group and the Spectator. But that bid by the American private equity firm was backed by an Abu Dhabi investment fund, and then there was a big political drama around that.
And it was led by an American Jeff Zucker
from a company called Redbird. So there was a huge outcry. Again, I wrote about this and you published it in Byline Times, but there was a huge outcry led by Andrew Neil at the Spectator, but by Telegraph and Spectator columnists. They said that the issue was that the Abu Dhabi fund was run by a member of the Emirati royal family, and therefore it was an Abu Dhabi government takeover. I argued that that was nonsense because actually the Abu Dhabi fund was going to be a passive investor, legally under English law, very strictly under English law, a passive investor with no rights at all. I thought Andrew Neil gave the game away in an interview on Newsnight where he sort of rather splenetically said, Jeff Zucker is a New York Democrat. What does he know about English newspapers? The Telegraph is the jewel in the crown of centre-right thought in Britain.
Right.
So it was all about essentially protecting that ecosystem.
The political ecosystem, but wasn't actually about foreign government investment.
Yes. So
just that Andrew Neil is chair of the Spectator.
He's the chairman of the Spectator. So now the situation is that the American private equity firm has had to put its option up for sale. So now essentially it's had to put the papers up for sale without ever actually getting control of them. But one of the slightly amusing ironies of this situation is that quite a lot of the bidders who protested about the American private equity bid on the basis that it had Abu Dhabi money are now find that they can't bid. I mean, particularly the Mail Group can't bid. The Rothermere family can't bid because they had hoped to use Middle Eastern money themselves.
To raise the billion to buy that option.
To raise the money.
And there's been a change in the law.
And there's been a change in the law, which they lobbied for, but now it's, they're now hoisted by their own petard. So that leaves essentially the front runner, and according to a report yesterday on Sky News, Paul Marshall, who's the owner of GB News, hedge fund manager, seems to be close to buying the Spectator and is a front runner to buy the Telegraph Group.
They're separate bids now, effectively.
It looks as if, from that report, as if they're being sold separately.
So when people buy these things, we know, just for example, Paul Marshall has lost about 80 million on GB News. That's never made any money, no advertisers, very little revenue of any type. Is the Telegraph potentially profitable? Is this a business?
Apparently it is. I've not seen the...
Well, how do the Barclay brothers therefore run up $1 billion debt?
They have the most opaque corporate structure. They own all sorts of different things. But basically they owed Lloyds Bank £1 billion, but not against... The Telegraph was one of their assets.
Right.
It took Lloyds 12 years to effectively get their hands on the Telegraph. It was a very good book published last year about the Barclay brothers and the Barclay family, tracing their business dealings over 40 or 50 years. And there's one of the things that comes through is that utterly opaque. Everything is offshore.
Because they're in Sark, aren't they? Well, there were some island off Guernsey.
It's all out in the British Virgin Islands, and they're interlocking corporate structures. So it took Lloyds 12 years to crunch its way through to finally...
And they'd lent them the money without knowing where the money
Well, so after the financial crisis in 2008, basically, they'd been lent money by this HBOS, which was this,
Of course.
and so Lloyds then bought HBOS, and they suddenly found themselves with this enormous, very badly drafted loan.
Right.
But they had to then try and find an asset that they could get their hands on. It took, as I say, 12 years to get their hands on it. But
do you think for someone like Paul Marshall, who also runs Unheard through a charitable trust or some kind of fund, which is a kind of, I'd say, it's a nationalist populist version of The Spectator. That's not nationalist populist, mainly online. It's not a print edition. That if you are somebody like Paul Marshall, who made with his partner Waste Marshall made 450 million out of Brexit, they made some quite considerable amount of money on NatWest, the problems they got on with Nigel Farage and the monitoring of his Coots account. Are you looking in the classic to make a return, or are you looking for other advantages to owning a newspaper? You were at the Times. The Times does make money. I think the Sun's been losing money for a while. So there's a commercial decision for Rupert Murdoch to own the Times, and as well as a political one. But something like the Telegraph, or certainly GB News, seems to be more an influence machine than a commercial operation. Is that unfair?
I don't know what Paul Marshall,
Paul, if you want to ring in to tell us.
what he sees as assets. I mean, I should just say, obviously anybody who wants to invest in journalism is fine by me. We welcome that. But the Telegraph, by all accounts, is profitable. And the private equity firm that was buying it was certainly looking at a commercial opportunity.
Right.
They were looking to expand it into America, was what they saw as the big commercial opportunity. And actually, according to reports, the American private equity firm may come back with another bid, but with different investors.
Oh,
so
that would be
it's possible they end up owning it in the end. I would assume that if Paul Marshall was to buy it, he would look at it as folding it into his other businesses, or
Yes.
putting them all together and
Amortizing costs.
yeah, and then he may have some strategy, I don't know, that puts them all together. But clearly, he's always been very politically engaged. Funny enough, when I first met him, he was a Lib Dem. So
Hope Not Hate have done an analysis of his tweets and retweets, which showed him going to more what we used to call the alt-right, which I think leads us, because we could talk all day. In fact, we should do this again with Simon, because are you finding it fascinating, Hardeep?
Yeah. I mean, I always find our conversations with Simon fascinating, just
so many insights.
of the level of detail of how these organisations work. It's always
And he'll be writing a regular column for Byline Times, we hope now. I've got to screw him hand down and sign the contract and get him to commit to that. But these are fascinating insights as understanding business. But shifting more slightly to the political domain, because this does reflect on GB News and what happened this week, particularly in Southport, but happened in London, Hartlepool and Aldershot, which was, I think we can say without a shadow of doubt, mainly organised by people like Tommy Robinson, right-wing riots, not just protests. Over 50 police officers injured in Southport on an attack on a mosque. This arose, and they're still apparently trying to protest outside mosques this weekend, because some false information on the internet that the person who'd stabbed three to death, 3 children and a young girl practicing a Taylor Swift concert, was somehow of Muslim background and a refugee, and it all turns out to be false. I think Islam made a very strong statement that just as these police officers were dealing with a tragic scene, 3 dead children, many others injured, the next thing they have to do is right-wing thugs throwing bricks at them. But it seems like this isn't going away in a hurry. I don't know why they're protesting outside mosques, but this might be something to do, Hardeep, of some work we did earlier with another Andrew Kersley investigation, how this Muslim grooming gangs is now such a powerful meme, and all the rhetoric is enough and save the children. It's this horrible, which is the origin of the blood libel, mainly directed against Jews in medieval Europe, that they made their matzos bread from the blood of children. Using children, weaponize the injuries and deaths of children to attack another religion is a very scary and historic dark shadow.
Yeah, I've been quite unsettled by the coverage of what's happened in Southport this week, because for me there are 2 different things going on. On one level, it is good to see much more widespread coverage of what has happened in relation to far-right tactics, the impact of misinformation on social media, and the notion of how the government and the police tackle extremism within our society. So I think that broadly is to be welcomed. But I do think there's a sense that it does feel like the media as a whole has suddenly amplified what's happened. And I think it's always about striking that balance, because it does, again, give the impression to somebody who's not sitting here in a room like us looking at this in a specialist way, but the members of the public, that this is a real big thing that's developing. It does risk giving that impression, a disproportionate impression, that we all need to focus on this because this is a very big thing that's happening now. And actually, it's not just about Southport, it's about London, and a sense that this could become widespread. So I think that needs to be checked and considered. But I also think what's problematic is giving it prominence as a news story and looking at all of the details and following it in real time without any of the underlying context and examination of the structural forces, which we know.
Going back to COVID, we started watching these groups during 24
and that's
years
not
ago.
just a notion of how conspiracy theories are emerging with much more far-right ideology, but also I think where this Muslim grooming gangs or Islamophobia, how that is developed in our society, right? And what is troubling about this is nowhere in this coverage, which again amplifies this issue, is there a notion of the political climate we are in and providing some context to the reader that at once we're not as divided as a country as these headlines and all of this coverage might give the impression that we are. But also there has been a toxification in recent years of the political climate.
Yeah.
Especially around issues such as Islamophobia and the Muslim grooming gangs narrative. And that certain politicians who have had prominent positions within politics and certain established publications in the more traditional press and the media as a whole,
like the Times,
has contributed to normalizing a political environment which is about emphasizing division and these narratives that are very binary about us versus them. These people are doing this. And so the media and politics has a role in that environment, in creating that environment. But nowhere in any of the coverage of this now is almost like a sudden big news story.
Which we've been covering for years. Yeah.
Is any explanation of how big is this a problem for society? Is it getting more out of control? Does it require quite a hard response, new policies, or do we need to look at existing policies? But also, where does this all come from? And that is not to suggest that politicians such as Nigel Farage or Reform, and there are 5 Reform MPs in Parliament, it's nothing to suggest that they had any connection to what's gone on in Southport or London or the riots. There's no suggestion that the two things are connected, but Farage's response to the riot or the violence, the killings in Southport was, I don't know whether we're being given all of the truth or whether we're being told the whole story, which does lean into conspiracy theory. And Neil Basu, who was the Metropolitan Police's former head of counter-terrorism, his opinion was that these sorts of narratives being said by people who are invested with the position of being an elected politician, they do contribute to inciting disorder and violence of this kind. And we know that Farage and Reform, just before the election, you know, we've covered it before in the podcast, the activists that were filmed calling the Prime Minister then, Rishi Sunak, the P word, saying all sorts of things which are homophobic.
Also the whole great replacement theory, migration, others coming to...
Yeah, so all of this, but so why isn't any of this explored? Why is the water that we swim in not explored? Well, it's not, because the media is focused on this thing has happened, these are the main actors at play. People like Farage have said these things. This is Keir Starmer's response. But again, we will move on in a matter of days. Everyone will just move on.
I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I mean, just to be clear what Farage has said, he said, it's weird they're not naming the suspect, the accused now, of this crime. But there was a very good reason under 18. He knew that. He's also said it's going to get worse this weekend. So even in that sense of borderline incitement, it's using this threat. He's often used this. If you didn't have me, the far right would be much worse. We have GB News, and I criticised her, Michelle Dubry, she didn't like it, saying, I'd completely condemn the criminality. But why, when white working class people speak up, does the government crack down on them? That's awful. And so you have this borderline encouragement, a sense that Overton Winterby shifted to the further right, and they benefit by saying we're the reasonable ones. I think two things happening here. I don't think what you feel about this, Simon, is the Daily Mail, in fact, erroneously led on, this is a Russian influence operation. So we've been writing about these accounts and these Russian Olgido troll farms and the way they create division in the US and here, especially around Islamophobia for years. It's quite good to see it on the front page of the Mail for once, because they don't like Russia. That's one thing even if they did get it slightly wrong. And I did notice a lot of other newspapers are doing what we used to do, which is track down network effects. You had Skyding, it had Channel 4 naming somebody we knew who falsely named a Muslim refugee for this. And that is quite heartening, because it means we don't have to do so much work. But Simon, do you think they failed to connect it to mainstream politicians? Farage, who's been on Question Time 35 times. And I'm always mixed feelings when people, and somebody said it to me today, a professor, a good guy I very much admire, said, don't give them so much oxygen, right? Ignore them, they'll go away. Well, we did ignore them for a long time, and they just got worse. Where's as somebody who's being slowly radicalized by the last 5 years since Brexit, what's your position on how we connect the dots to these far-right groups and how mainstream politicians deal with them?
Well, I don't consider myself to have been radicalised, Peter, but
just woke up. Just woke up.
But one of the problems is that Farage has been so normalised over such a long time that he's now in Parliament with 5 MPs, and so he's delivering these messages now from behind a desk with a suit and tie and 2 Union Jacks, and that creates a problem. Actually, I think the narratives, you say, are not really being explored, because the mainstream Conservatives were getting some traction with these issues. They were leaning into them for a long time. There was an undercurrent of Islamophobia, I think, running through the Conservative Party for a long time, and increasingly in the last couple of years. And I think that as reform became more powerful, they lent into it further. I think actually one of the interesting situations now, and thought struck me in the last couple of days actually, was that Farage has gone so far off the reservation with his dog whistling on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's to become sort of really quite unacceptable. And I thought, his latest one yesterday, I totally condemn mob violence, but was a case in point. And at the same time, the Conservative Party did just well enough in the election to think that they don't need to merge with him.
Yes, right.
So I think it's an interesting moment for that whole ecosystem now. And I thought it was very interesting and actually slightly worrying that none of the Conservative leadership candidates went on to X to say anything about Farage's comments, because I thought that, that was an obvious...
They could distinguish themselves.
Yeah. And it was something that they still don't know how to handle, that whole reform thing. And of course, actually, it was some of the reform people themselves went on to condemn the violence very quickly after they could see where the narrative was heading. So, but I think it's an interesting moment where the Conservative Party in its leadership election, and whether they start to try and distance themselves from Farage and reform, or how they navigate that, I think, is going to be quite
And how do you think Starmer did? I was, after 8 years, condemning extremism, but not when it's right-wing extremism, which we've seen, and so calling people protesting for a ceasefire in Gaza as sort of extremists, which we had from Suella Braverman. I thought it was quite interesting how tough Starmer was. He did say something about, which we liked, I'm not going to do the politics of performance, I'm going to do the politics of delivery. And he made the point about the attack on public servants of police officers. But he also said this thing about online where crimes are being committed in plain sight. But he did say he would be in discussion with the media owners, people like Musk, who only last night endorsed Tommy Robinson. It seemed to me that he was meeting these police chiefs. He said, I'm not going to change the legislation. We're just going to use what existing structures to make them join up to stop, because these people were traveling from various places. That you may get some, not much performance, but a bit more delivery, and that they might be better at tamping down these. That's why it's a slightly reassuring feeling that sort of grown-ups were in charge. And he didn't criticise Nigel Farage, he refused to do that, which I thought was quite good. And what's your feeling about it? Hardeep, what did you feel about Starmer yesterday?
I think there is something to be said about focusing on delivery. But this is what I'm always talking about. I don't think it's really just about that. I think it is about the political climate and the waters we swim in, the culture around us. And I think Keir Starmer should have said, this protest, this violence took place outside of a mosque. It's not clear at all what the connection is between the mosque and the killings of 3 children going to a dance class. And this sort of rhetoric from Farage and anybody, politicians or otherwise, who are linking Islam to this crime is inflammatory and divisive. And I was surprised we didn't hear that. I'm surprised that we didn't hear more about Islamophobia, anti-Muslim narratives, how that is dangerous and damaging to our society, because there has to be some distinction between the Conservative Party that has just been in government, of which people like Suella Braverman, who's the former Home Secretary, was mentioning Muslim grooming gangs and narratives like that quite prominently. There has to be a distinction between that and what the Labour government is offering. So in a way...
But that's rhetoric. Maybe they offer more actions and clamp down.
Sure, but action in itself, action is good, especially when it takes place in a focused way behind closed doors. But I actually think the messages that the public are being sent and communicated is important too. So Farage is using his platform to communicate certain messages. I'm not sure why that's not being countered by a Labour Prime Minister by saying this violence outside of a mosque quite clearly, at the very least, has connotations that are Islamophobic.
It's interesting. I listened to the statement too, and I did wonder that too. I would imagine they must have discussed it, and so it was a conscious decision, you would have thought. I was listening to a podcast this morning about how Kamala Harris should respond to Trump's race baiting.
Say it to my face.
Yeah, but that was before. This was when did she become black?
Right, yes, yeah.
That she'd always been Indian, but then she turned black.
Yes, and this podcast by Democrat strategists on Pod Save America, which I do enjoy. It's a very good analysis. This is very good analysis. But they were discussing, one of the issues for her is that she does not want to be defined by race, and she does not want to run this as a black candidate. She wants to run as, modern America is biracial, and this is this is not 2024. This is a different. So she responded to it by saying same old device and division, and just moved on. And this is going to be a theme, and I think probably the same calculations perhaps apply here, in a sense that if Starmer had come out and said this was outside mosque and it was Islamophobic, then essentially that then becomes the story. I don't know if that helps the Muslim community, Muslims, more than just saying this is far-right thuggery, wherever it is, and we're taking it on. So I just wonder if actually just by allowing their framing of what they're doing, one's actually playing their game.
So it's very interesting, the framing, because I have a lot of right-wing counts follow me, particularly last night. I had to block a few of them. But they are in this extreme situation. It's kind of a mixture of old, very conspiratorial left and right. Oh, now they're stamping down. Facial recognition. The autocrat, we've got to have pictures of Starmer, Stalin. They're going down this vector, is that they're really being targeted. That's very interesting. You're right, it's not about our Muslims, our brothers and sisters and co-citizens and co-workers. It's gone to another extreme. So, it's very interesting to watch that development.
Also, just to take that point, it's really, really interesting because there's also in the discussion of this, as Simon says, does that help the Muslim community to actually not have it be explicitly about Islamophobia, or is it to their detriment? These narratives do become normalized, and if they're not dealt with head on, that ends up affecting everyone in the Muslim community when huge numbers don't agree with any of this. But what's interesting is this notion that by acknowledging something, one becomes defined by it.
Yes.
Right. It's very interesting about Kamala Harris. I've said this about Rishi Sunak. In the very final moments, as Prime Minister, he finally said using the P word is racist, and that is awful, and it's an important thing to tell the country that that's not acceptable. And he was so conscious, I think, on one level to not want to be defined by his race or any notion that he should be or has to be, that I would say, in his case, I would say he also stoked the culture war, which was not good. But there's a notion that we so don't want to be defined by this thing that is a reality, that any mention of it is potentially detrimental or potentially making it more of an issue than we want. But I'm still thinking about it, but I'm not sure that approach is ultimately tenable, because the reality is Kamala Harris is a black woman, she's an Indian woman, Rishi Sunak's a man of color. These are realities. And it's this either or thing, because society and politics and the culture of it is saying, well, what are you? You're either this or that, and you have to be. Whereas it doesn't leave much room to say, well, yeah, I am Indian, I am a black woman, but also I'm going to be a president for everyone. It's always how the fear of these narratives becoming defining and limiting of the people, I think, involved, like Sunak and Kamala Harris.
Don't fence me in. I mean, it's back to that issue, and we're going to have to close soon, unfortunately. We keep on going all evening. Do you ignore them, they go away, or if you don't ignore them, they stay. And we will see this weekend, won't we, what actually happens with these threatened 17 potential sites of riots and more right-wing activity. Simon, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully come back again, because I think really insights. Hardeep, we may be taking a break, I think. I won't be here next week. Maybe you'll run it in my absence. I don't know. I'm sure it'll be fine without me. And thank you all for listening. The new edition of Byline Times, we're starting editing next week. It'll be in the shops the week afterwards, but you can keep on buying the current one, which is up to date. There's a new podcast out beyond this one, which on the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the birth of James Baldwin, has Hardeep and Bonnie Greer exploring his Harlem, her Harlem, and his struggle for human rights and civil rights and not being defined, in fact, as just a black man. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we'll hopefully see you next week, if not the week after.